Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Love on Campus acknowledges the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, land never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the rich living traditions of storytelling and knowledge of this country. We also extend respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait and First Nations, recognising the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Love on Campus. This week, in our sort of 4-week structure that we do with our podcast, we are looking at a trope. And the trope that we're looking at this week is enemies to lovers.
Oh, love it. It's everyone's favourite trope.
Yes.
I think it actually ranks as number one.
Oh, definitely. It's
I would imagine.
Absolutely, particularly large moment, thanks to TikTok, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm so new. I'm so new to hosting these things.
You're fine. You're doing a great job, Georgia.
I'm here today, of course, with Kathleen Stanley.
Hello.
And Dr. Amy Matthews.
Hello.
That's what I was being told behind the mic. Go introduce
Outing
us,
it.
please.
Outing it.
Okay. So I wanted to start with a question because I always tend to start things with questions. My lectures, everything, it starts with a question. Enemies to lovers is like so overwhelmingly popular, specifically at the moment, and just in general in the romance genre. Why do we think so many people love it? It's a big question.
Big question with lots of laneways that it opens up. Do you want to go first, Kathleen? Because you know I can hijack it.
or even just why do you like it, if you do like it or don't like it?
Yeah. I mean, enemies to lovers is pretty much what it is, right? Like enemies to lovers.
Yeah,
people who don't get along to people who fall in love. I think for me it harkens to the opposites attract thing a little bit. I think people like the idea of falling in love and getting along with things that feel like the opposite. But I don't actually think that's what enemies to lovers is at all, because I think it's usually people are closer to you than. Does this make sense? Like it's
they're incredibly similar.
Yeah,
And
it's your worst traits being projected back to you in another person and finding a way to fall in love with them. Oh, maybe that's what I think.
I have something written here where it says a lot of people like enemies to lovers because it's someone seeing all the bad in you and loving you anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, so you get all the bad first and you get all the things that annoy you, and still at the end of everything, someone loves you.
I think also, like, I always go to, sorry, Star Wars nerd, but I always go to Han and Leia, right? Because I think that's based on classic Hollywood structures.
Some of the original enemies to lovers.
Yeah. But you can go back to, like, Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, or, I mean, there's plenty of examples, Bogart and Bacall. And I think what it is also is about someone who presses your vulnerabilities, and what you have with enemies to lovers is two people whose hackles are up because they're at risk, like their vulnerabilities are pressed.
Yeah.
So if you think about Han and Leia, both of them are absolutely triggered by the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's terrified. And she is also terrified. And I think that leads to conflict. That leads to people acting like dicks.
Well, I was thinking about some of the big popular enemies to lovers that we sort of see in media, and I was thinking about Bridgerton season 2.
I love that season.
That season particularly was so good.
He is so good at the smouldering longing.
Yeah.
Yes.
People say there's a lot about gay men who take on like straight romantic roles. They're like straight women love them. The priest in Fleabag.
Oh my God, that is one of the best romances ever. Season 2 of Fleabag.
Exactly. And then
not a romance, a love story.
Yeah. And then Johnny Bailey in Bridgerton. But I was thinking about that and how they both essentially sort of harbour the same worries, the same sort of.
They're kind of the same person.
Yeah, they're like the same person, and that causes them to be some form of enemy. but they kind of love each other anyway. I think that
it's so passionate, right? There's like the passions are right up there on the surface, really fired up, ready to go. It's like that thin line that kind of is revealed. I actually think he's a real scene stealer too.
Yeah.
He was a real scene stealer in that.
I have to say as well, just as a writer and probably as a reader, it's attractive because there's a lot of energy on the page. Like there's a lot of really snappy dialogue. It can be very funny.
Yeah.
It moves really quickly.
Are they easier to write?
Yeah, way easier.
Yeah. I wondered.
Yeah. I mean, I'm writing something where they don't hate each other at all, and that's hard.
Yeah, it can get just a bit nice. Here, have a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Whereas if they like always have something that's like annoying them, they're like, oh God.
The tension's right there.
Like she gets stung by a bee in Bridgerton, and he's like, God, why did you get stung by a bee? It's
You intolerable woman, how could you do this to me?
like it's just so, there's always something.
But also I think irritation is inherently funny. And I think particularly when it's like they don't even know why they're irritated. They don't even know. And I think because in a good romance, it's because their core wounds are being pressed, right? They've got deep psychological bruising that's being pressed on.
Which I think I'm going to keep coming back to Bridgerton because it's a really good touch point, I think. But their wounds were so obvious, like Anthony and his dad, and
they did a really good job with that.
Yeah, and then Kate and her like sort of responsibility as an eldest daughter.
I think they did a great job actually, because I know we often talk about the feminism of romance, and it'd be easy to focus on Kate in Bridgerton, but I thought they did a really good job with Anthony's masculinity.
Yeah, they did.
With him, the tenderness of Anthony being squashed out of him with responsibility, having to be the man of the family, and just having to be the man of the family has caused him wounds. Like he's been damaged by having to live up to the role of masculinity he's been given.
That's what I mean too about him being a scene stealer. I feel that his character was just so well fleshed when they transferred it to the TV show, and he did such a good job with that. But then I also wonder if that's partly because like we're following the Bridgerton, so everything had to be focalised a little bit more through him anyway.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, like they were both beautiful, but I think of him every time I think of that season. He really dominates my mind.
Yeah. And he just breaks your heart. Just totally.
And do you know, when I think about Bridgerton season 2 as well, there's way less focus on sex. Like it's way more sort of broody and tense, and because they are enemies, they don't really, we don't even see them kiss until like the 6th episode or something.
It's quite far in.
Like it's really far in. And I think that
the sexual tension was incredible.
Yeah, and I think that enemies create, like the enemies to lovers thing has a sort of built-in sexual tension a lot of the time.
But also a longing, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm longing for you, but I also can't have you because you're too dangerous to me.
Yeah.
And there's something you said just a little bit before there, Amy, about writing it on the page and how it gives you this tension and a lot to work with. And Georgia sort of bounced off of that about the difference between writing sort of friends to lovers or just like people who are not on opposite sides of the fence. And I think we talked about last episode the rise of the rom-com.
Yep.
And I do think that one of the reasons Enemies to Lovers is so popular is because it's so easy to fit into that rom-com. Like it's the slapstick of it is kind of written there very naturally, and you can get away with it.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's not as challenging to write. You're not going to get boring or bogged down because it's so easy to just have really embarrassing cringe moments.
And so many scenarios will create tension.
But I think also it's a kind of, I'm sorry to keep coming back to masculinity. I've been reading a lot about masculinity lately, so everything is linking back to that for me. But thinking about like friends to lovers, often you get a cinnamon roll hero, right?
Yeah.
And
do love a cinnamon roll.
Yeah, me too. But the fantasy of the well-balanced, psychological, well-balanced, mature man is very different from the wounded boy child of Enemies to Lovers often. Like you often get slightly more alpha or at least, pretending to be alpha. But there's something very touching, I think, about those Enemies to Lovers heroes, about seeing behind the mask, which is what we're talking about with Bridgerton, is you get to see behind Anthony's kind of dickish rogue mask to the really wounded boy beneath.
Yeah.
And yet I think in Love on the Brain, that's enemies to lovers, yet I would say he's a cinnamon roll.
I'm going to argue with that during book club. I'm
there's a
happy
big
to talk
thing,
about that in book club.
But there's a big thing about his masculinity, isn't there?
Yeah.
And
And I think that it's mixed, and I think this is where we get into that mess of texts being consciously written by an author who's trying to do a thing and then reflecting a bunch of
Oh,
cultural
Yeah.
mess that we inherit.
I was going to say it's about the inheritance, isn't it? Like whether he was written a certain way or not, he's destined to inherit certain things.
Yeah.
But
Just
also
because.
the fantasy. I think our fantasy of men is reinscribing some
masculine
yeah,
norms, like this idea that you want him to be big and burly and strong and
Yeah.
protective and
Well, the world
that
is still
sort of
very
stuff.
scary for women, no matter how far we've come. And at the end of the day, unless men step up and change or do things, a lot of the time we feel very powerless.
But we're also reinscribing that by only choosing a certain kind of man to be the hero.
yeah.
Like we are fetishizing a certain kind of patriarchal masculinity in our books.
And I think that is so interesting that enemies to lovers likely often caters towards that, and then that is the trope that people really do jump to when they think of the romance genre.
Yeah, and probably because we are living in a certain patriarchal culture, and so we've got a lot to work through.
Yeah, and so we jump to those as a way to sort of, navigate the scenario of having men like that and hoping that they can still fall in love and still have a soft side.
Are you guys fans of enemies to lovers? Like, are they one of the tropes you gravitate towards?
Yes. Well, to be honest, so many popular books nowadays just all have
Just
it.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I read it by accident.
Yeah, I know. Well, I have a whole list of popular books, right? So
yay.
So I was looking up popular books. I looked up popular enemies to lovers, and just like by proxy, like it's just popular books really that are popping up. So there's The Hating Game.
Yeah.
That is a big enemies to lovers one. The Unhoneymooners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Spanish Love Deception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A Court of Thorns and Roses.
Yeah.
Mixed reaction.
And Beach Read by Emily Henry was counted as enemies to lovers. The Viscount Who
Book
Loved.
lovers as well would be.
Yeah, book lovers. I've got that here.
Yeah, well, we discussed this earlier. Georgia and I were like, Georgia's like, do you think it is? I'm like, yeah, definitely.
And then The Viscount Who Loved Me, which is Bridgerton season 2. Twisted Hate. That's the Twisted series by Anna Huang. I don't know.
I haven't read them yet.
I haven't
but
read them either.
Yeah.
I think a lot of them are enemies
A lot
to
of
lovers.
films are. Like,
Yeah.
when I was just thinking as you were talking, a lot of rom-coms are enemies to lovers.
Yeah.
And a lot of the fairy tale rewritings, you know how there's a really big popularity with the dark romance in particular?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I imagine a lot in dark romance is enemy to lovers, which is another reason it's probably so popular. But there's like a lot of, like I've read a few of the Peter Pan ones lately. And there's
and
a
they're enemies?
there's a very enemies to lovers sort of vibe. I mean, I've read a few dark romances. Look, I've gone down a few rabbit holes. Okay,
Peter Pan seems like such a childish narrative to me to turn that into like a
But
romance
Wendy
thing.
and Wendy and Peter Pan always had a little bit of.
They always had a bit of, a
Bickering,
bit of
didn't
romance,
they?
bit of love.
well, one of the ones I read, it's literally like adult, very adult versions.
Spicy.
Yeah, and Wendy's kidnapped by Peter
Oh,
Pan, right?
We're getting
And
into
is
the
Peter
full
Pan-
BDSM.
Does Peter Pan age?
No,
He's a pedo.
Please, like,
what
how
George is saying.
he's sort of like
How
at
many
a certain
lost boys
age.
are involved?
Yeah, okay, no, well, like,
Does it, like, is he older than like 12?
yes, that's why I said adult age.
Okay, good. Okay. He's an
Yeah,
adult.
there's this thing where they sort of are at an adult age. I think he's at a sexy man age. I don't know. He's a sexy man
Picturing
age.
Harry Styles now as Peter Pan.
I think a little bit older than that. But and he kidnaps, unfortunately,
I
though,
can see Harry
young
Styles playing
Wendy's.
Peter Pan, actually.
I would say 18-year-old Wendy's. I think it's like when she's about 18, but it's
So quite young.
every Wendy. Like every Wendy gets kidnapped, as in like every generation of Wendy when she turns 18.
right.
And it's to try and break some kind of curse or some random thing, and he ends up falling in love with this generation.
Hold on, wait a minute.
Of Wendy.
If this
Spoilers.
is sexual, is he like having sex with like her mother and her grandmother and her great grandmother? Because that would be wrong.
Oh, no, he does.
I can't remember. It's been a while, and I read them all very
I
quickly.
really don't want to sleep with any guy who's
Look,
been with my mother.
I wouldn't necessarily advertise these books as peak. It's really depends what you're into. They're very dark romance, and there's a lot of group sex, so it's definitely more erotica side. But then there's another one that I've got that I haven't read yet, but it's a Peter Pan one, and that this is like a hook. Falls in love with Wendy, but like it's not even set in Neverland. It's sort of like the characters are just like he's sort of some kind of hook and he owns a bar or something. It's like a gangster, and but her family is. I don't know if her family is meant to be Peter or if her like dad is just the dad who's because like in Peter Pan the dad's like super.
The Darlings.
Yeah, the Darlings. So it's like the
Great
Darlings
name.
versus
I always
the
wish
Hooks.
my surname was Darling.
Yeah, it's a great last name.
Amy Darling would be a good pseudonym.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I like it. That's your next
I
pseudonym,
don't
Amy.
need another one.
That's your
3
next.
names is enough for any
How many
person.
pseudonyms do you have now?
I have 3 names. So
3
3
names?
is enough.
I think it was an Emily Henry interview that I was watching where she said that she finds it a little bit difficult to write enemies to lovers sometimes, or that they don't stay enemies for particularly very long, if only because like where is the point of no return in terms of an enemy? Like how bad can things get with that
Well,
enemy?
Which is interesting because she's definitely written them.
but to me, when I read about them, they don't stay enemies for that long.
But
Like,
this is a subgenre thing again, right? Because you're talking rom-coms, like contemporary candy-coloured rom-coms.
yeah.
But I think in historical fiction it can get pretty bad.
Yeah, like it gets
Like I've read it, particularly in the old school romances, like you think about
rape fantasies.
yeah, not even, it doesn't always have to be rape, but yeah, like the old Joanna Lindsays, they went a long way. There was a Joanna Lindsay, I can't remember the name of it, something about surrender might be in the title, or prisoner, or prisoner of my desire, or something like that. But it's a medieval Viking kind of era one, and she's like she's like a wife of this noble guy who it's a horrible abusive thing, and she's still a virgin because he's really old and can't get it up, and he's dying or he's dead, and she's going to be cast out or thrown into a nunnery or something horrible is going to happen unless she's pregnant with his child. And so she has this captive.
What colour button is what the fuck?
Who did she fall in love with?
These are the bananas old school historical romances. They are nuts. So.
Does she fall in love
they're
with the old
crazy.
guy?
No. So what? He's dead. Her husband, who she never had sex with, and there is Viking raids are happening on their land, and they capture a Viking, and he's the hero, but he's kept as a slave, and she basically rapes him to try and get pregnant, so she's not thrown out. And then he gets free, and then he captures her and basically rapes her. And so, like, they've each raped each other, but they can get pretty.
Yeah, like
They can go
get pretty
past
dark,
the point of no return. And there are pirate ones.
And
there are a lot of old school.
Yeah, because like one rape doesn't cancel out another. Sorry.
I suppose, like, that would really only exist the ability to get past that and to then enter into a loving
There's a lot of,
relationship.
like Kathleen said, like, I mean, the candy-coloured rom-coms are, fairly new. They're only a few years old in the market, but romance has been around a long time, and there's a lot of subgenres that get quite dark, that get quite spicy, that get into BDSM, that get into all kinds of quite heavily sexual material.
That's what I kind of am wondering when we're talking enemies to lovers and its revitalization. We're talking really about the revitalization in that candy-coloured popular rom-com,
and it's
yet
generational, right?
it's existed in all sorts of forms for such a long time. And like you said, I mean, you just gave us a really great description of
There
how
are worse than that.
Yeah, of how. But like, if you even now, you just take one step sideways to the more dark romances or into erotic romance, and
it's all out there.
You've got a different type of enemies to lovers in a very different kind of way.
And I think we talked about this in our first episode, like definitions of romance. It's very easy to kind of find yourself fixated on one small niche of it, but it's a massive industry, like huge, with like such a scope of subgenres and tropes and such a scope of audiences that, the readership is not the same necessarily from one area to the next. Like, I am not really into highly sexual romance. I'm not that interested in it. So it's not my area, but other people do research in that area. So good for them.
I have this quote from because I was initially going to do my PhD on the enemies to lovers trope.
That's right. You were quite obsessed with it.
And so, because I just think that like the cultural interest in it is so interesting.
There's so much interesting stuff in power dynamics
and
there.
no one's ever
I think especially the way it's been rewritten into these bubblegum romances.
And no one's ever really defined the trope in itself. And I think that that's interesting. So when I was going through all my notes from when I read a bunch of stuff, and I found this quote, and it's about the Sheik.
Oh, yeah, because they were really big in the 70s. That was Joanna Lindsay's very first book. Yeah. So she was one of the blockbuster rom-com. Like, she had Fabio covers. She's what people think of when they say bodice ripper. And her very first book was the Chic book.
Yeah.
And if we're going back to Regis for a hot sec, Regis does use the Chic when discussing 20th century romances.
Yeah, it comes up
and Mills and Boon, Harlequin Mills and Boon have whole subgenres around Arab heroes and sheiks.
Yeah.
Sorry, Georgia, what's your quote?
So I think that they were talking about how he's relative, like he's abusive, and it's like, I don't know the plot of the Sheik very well, but it was in this article called Love and Romance Novels, where it says, love does not need to be rational or moral. Love is mysterious, irresistible, overwhelmingly passionate and erotic. It begins wholly as the province of feelings rather than the mind or morals.
And who was the scholar?
Teo.
So is that Hsu-Ming Teo?
Yeah, Hsu-Ming Teo.
She's amazing. She's such a great scholar. She's here in Australia if anyone's interested.
Yeah.
She was at, I'm trying to think where she was at.
Was it Macquarie?
Macquarie maybe, or UTS, one of those.
Yeah, it's a really good article.
But she's such a good scholar.
And I thought that it was so interesting, this idea that there's like a passion there before there's a love, and that it sort of has this intangible beginning.
Yeah.
This sort of... And
there's an energy to them.
Yeah, there's an energy, which, as you were talking about, there's an energy on the page, even just when you're writing it.
Well, it's like to go back to my Star Wars analogy, I agree with Ali Hazelwood that Empire Strikes Back is one of the best movies ever made. But, you know, there is this sense, like when they made the first film, the intention was for Luke and Leia to be the couple. But Han,
we're brother and sister
eventually. But Han Solo and Leia had such energy, right?
Yeah.
You just couldn't deny the tension and the
yes.
And I think that often happens in texts, right? Where in films and TV series, particularly TV series, where two actors might have chemistry, and often it's an adversarial chemistry.
Well, didn't that happen with the latest Star Wars installment? Like everyone
God, the Kylo.
We don't talk. We don't talk about that. I'm sorry.
Well, we're going to have to, because that's what Ali Hazelwood writes all about.
Yeah.
That's where these all come from. She, like, the tension there was so good for her that she's become a best-selling romance novelist.
And it wasn't just her. Like, the Raylo stuff is huge, and because they had such antagonistic tension.
I'm sorry, I did not see it.
And they wrote it in.
It's because he's such an abusive dick.
It's because I fell asleep because they're boring.
No, they're not. They're
great
not films. Sorry. For everyone who loves them, I don't think they're terribly well written.
I agree. I'm an OG Star Wars galley.
I think it needs to be on the record that I've never watched Star Wars.
Oh, Georgia.
Have you never seen Empire Strikes Back?
I think I watched half.
Can you please watch Empire Strikes Back with me? Because I really want you to see the love story of Han and Leia.
I think I watched the one where they get in like in a trash chute.
No, that's the first one.
Yeah, that's the first one.
Han and Leia in Empire Strikes Back. So it's directed by Irvin Kershner, who is like old school MGM style director.
Yeah, I like that.
Who really, it is one of the great, like it's like a golden age Hollywood love story in a space opera. They are so good, and the scenes between them are so good. The dialogue, the longing, you would love it.
I totally agree. It doesn't even matter what else is going on. Like, it doesn't matter what else is going on in Star Wars. You can really just watch it for Han and Leia, at least Empire.
So we're having an Empire Strikes Back night, and then Georgia will tell you what she thought of it.
I should.
Do it.
I
it's
should
happening.
watch it. But to be fair,
maybe we should like do a watch-a-thon if everybody at home wants to watch.
And I will break down the Han and Leia, like why it's such a great romance and why they screwed it up by splitting them up.
We'll do an Insta Live or something.
Anyway, we're going back to your quote. Let's stop derailing.
Well, I was going to start bringing up like old Hollywood enemies to lovers movies. That's what I was going to do.
The old. Oh my! Has anyone seen Singing in the Rain? Gene
Yes.
Kelly and Debbie Reynolds. That's an enemies to lovers.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I
yes.
I watched a Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward one.
Oh, they are so good.
Oh,
together.
they're so good. And they're like, they're in love when you're watching the movie. You know that they're together. Everyone knows that they're together. Like,
my
it's
God.
Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman. And it's called A New Kind of Love. And it is like the best rom-com I've ever watched in my life. It's so good. She's like this, she's basically what you would probably describe as a tomboy, but like she's very like brash and very committed to her career and all this sort of stuff. And she goes to Paris, but then she pretends to be this sort of feminine, I think she pretends to be a prostitute.
As you do.
And he...
Can I just say that is such a popular enemies to lover golden age thing? Like she was a tomboy who liked to work.
Yeah. And no, but it is really interesting because Joan Woodward, I think, was so interested in sort of the certain women she played, and so she tried to be quite different with it. It's really good.
Have you seen, either of you seen His Girl Friday?
No.
Oh my God. There's another movie night. So it's Cary Grant and it's going to come to me. I've lost it. Anyway, it will come to me. But the dialogue in that is amazing. So they're a divorced couple and he runs a newspaper and she used to be his top reporter and she wants to they're about to get divorced, but he won't sign the papers and she wants to get remarried. And so the whole film, she's trying to get him to sign the divorce papers and they're just at each other's throats in the funniest way. And they've got such
funny is
sexual
that?
tension. It's really good.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm an Audrey Hepburn golden age girl.
Uh-huh.
So I've seen like every single Audrey Hepburn movie, I think, under the sun. So I guess what Funny Face, that would be a good enemies to lovers.
With Fred Astaire.
Yeah. I'm thinking
Rosalind Russell. It's Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. It's so good.
They do tropes and they do that sort of stuff really well in old Hollywood, don't they?
But I think, Enemies to Lovers is a good one because you can do the screwball comedy, fast dialogue.
Yes.
Like it's so quick. Katharine Hepburn is obviously one of the best
actresses of all time.
Yeah, and also all her, even African Queen with Humphrey Bogart. That's so good. I also liked The Mummy. Brendan Fraser.
Yes.
And, I mean, they're an enemies to lovers at the beginning, kind of.
Academic too.
Oh, yeah.
I read an article the other day. It's like Rachel Weisz is like the ultimate lesbian.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm
her,
saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's like the Mummy's the sexual awakening of a bunch of people, Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing.
I do like them both. I rate them both. And I do rate the Mummy.
Anyway, back to talking.
Yeah,
about
sorry, Georgia. I feel like we've
we've
derailed your
derailed
quote.
Yes. The quote was about, just about how there's like a tension and there's like this connection to them before there's ever sort of like some sort of mind or morals is what it's saying.
I guess if you think film as well, like 10 Things I Hate About You.
Oh, do like
There's
that
also
one.
Enemies to Lovers. The Proposal, Enemies to Lovers.
Oh yeah, I think I like Enemies to Lovers film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
I'm like, as you're listening, I'm like, oh yeah, I love that movie. Oh yeah, I love that
Maybe
movie.
it's because you get
When Harry Met Sally is Enemies to Lovers, then Friends to Lovers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Maybe it's just because you get less of like the internal stuff in a movie and there's less sort of.
I think you need the energy of the combat, because I think people being nice to each other is lovely, but it's very you're right. It's the internal. It's very hard to do internal conflict in the same way as external conflict in film.
Yeah.
What's that one with Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks?
Sleepless in Seattle or You've Got Mail.
You've Got Mail. That's Enemies to Lovers too.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's true.
Just going through my head. I'm like, wait, I watched one recently. What was that? That was the one.
But you know how I was recently messaging these guys, maybe it was last year, I can't remember, but about how I'm so behind generationally on certain films. So I was watching films that I had not caught up with. Like The Duff. I messaged
yes.
Yeah, The Duff.
Anyway, I tried The Kissing Booth the other day.
Oh God, that's bad.
Yeah,
That started as fan fiction.
I gave that one up.
That is bad.
But
the only reason I think I've gotten through those is because Jacob Elordi is hot. That's all I got.
Not going to lie, that's probably why some movies just make it, right?
They do expose his body as much as they expose her body, I have to say.
Yeah. I met him once, actually.
Really?
Oh.
Yeah, he's really tall and really nice.
Because is he Australian?
I think George's voice is even blushing.
He's really tall and he was really nice.
But he's an Aussie, right?
I spoke to him about
Am
movies.
I remembering that correct?
Yeah, he's Aussie.
Yeah.
And that's almost a whole romance genre, Aussie heroes.
Yeah, the Aussie Hollywood effect.
Or like the running into the celebrities in the middle of Noosa High Street. That's where I met him. But yeah, there's a lot of...
I think he's a big smoker. I don't know why that's relevant. But I'm just saying, like, that takes him down a notch for me.
Per the last episode...
So you'd be enemies to lovers over the smoking.
Oh, yes, filthy habit.
Per the last episode, he's a bit of a, pretentious reader, Bukowski, Murakami.
Yeah, he
vibe,
gives
I
that
think he
vibe,
does. Yeah.
totally.
I don't even know what we were talking about.
We were talking about energy on the page. Now we're a bit flustered.
No, you were telling us about movies that you watched, Amy.
Yeah, we were talking about
I got that
that
because I was thinking about enemies to lovers because the Duff is kind of one.
Yeah, but not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They're just enemies because she's like.
They're next door neighbours.
Yeah.
but she
Yeah, they're
don't
kind of like
him.
friends at the same time, though. Like,
Kind of, but antagonistically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I go off into movies because I did a film degree as well. But a lot of.
What's that? And that Kate Hudson and Matthew McConaughey one is kind of, that one is like a fake out
10
enemies
Things
to
I Hate
lovers.
10 Things I Hate About You.
No, that's
you
the
mean
Heath Ledger one. How to Lose a Guy in 10 days.
It's
That's
got
it.
10 in it.
That's why I couldn't remember because of the 10 and because we'd said the other, like that one's sort of like a fake out enemies to lovers because they're both faking so
Yeah,
much,
that's right.
but they actually are enemies and they do fall in
I
love.
think it
And then
gives
they
you-
get like a revamp of enemies to lovers during their black moment.
Enemies to lovers gives you a plot to hang on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and often, so here, this will break it down a bit more. Thinking about when they are enemies, because often, like I mentioned, His Girl Friday, they started out in love and married, and we meet them at the divorce point when they're enemies. And it's a bit like, I was thinking about Indiana Jones, the first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark, with Marion, who I think is a great heroine. But we meet them at
Are
the
you
point.
a Harrison Ford fan by any chance, Amy?
Except he's a bit old for me. He's like my dad's age. But
That's not
it
stopping
was
anything.
just the era that I grew
Still
up
hot.
in.
It's me and Keanu Reeves.
you and Paul Newman, my
Yeah,
friend. But thinking about, Indiana Jones, like you meet them when they're enemies, but they had also been lovers. So
Yeah.
often I think there's a second chance thing that often goes on in these as well.
Yeah.
Like you get
Yes,
lovers to enemies to lovers.
Yeah.
And it gives you a really easy barrier as well as an easy barrier to reoccur and like your point of ritual death,
Yeah.
which we'll be talking about later. But these moments like enemies to lovers, it's all built in. Like it's all
It
already
is.
there. It's like you don't have to really reveal it because it's just what it is. Like
and you can kind of there's always like an inevitable black moment, that point of ritual death, the moment that something's going to happen.
Because I
It's
think
like,
yeah.
the problem often with, because we're also romance writers, and when you're a writer, one of the biggest dangers is running out of plot. Like,
ding ding, that's what happened. That's what happened to me.
George's current issues.
this is why it's interesting because we're doing it as we're talking about it.
Yeah.
But you run out of steam halfway through if you don't have enough conflict. And the thing about the enemies to lovers is, as you were saying about barriers, Kathleen, is that they keep putting barriers up.
Yeah.
Because
So
they
there's-
don't want to like each other. They want to maintain that
Yeah.
enemy thing. Almost like the comfortability of being enemies. Like it's like in Love on the Brain.
But it's about fear too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about it's too risky to let those boundaries
Yeah.
down.
Especially if you're competing in or fighting over something that is reflected back. So, like if the heroine is seeing her worst traits in the hero, if she accepts and loves him, she also has to accept and love all of those things about herself. And that's a double vulnerability, like not just trusting somebody else and letting them in, it's also learning to love all of your own flaws and loving those parts of yourself that, you don't want to, you don't even want to admit maybe that are flaws. Actually, that's probably a huge part of it.
yeah.
So I think there's it's just really gritty. That's a really great and easy way. And then like for your moment of breaking them towards the end where they have to ultimately get back together, it's the test where you can just test, do you love yourself enough? Do you love these flaws enough to be able to let somebody else in? And for a lot of people, that challenge and that thought and that vulnerability is too much. Like, it's just like, I need to step away from it. And, you know, we always know they're going to come back together. But the seeing of how people work through that and do that, that's very hopeful.
So that's really cool. That's that idea of so the one Kathleen's advancing is that you have to accept and love yourself if you are similar.
Even that other way around that I was talking about, how it's someone seeing all the bad things in you first and you having to come to terms with all those things, so and knowing that those things are even still lovable, that they don't need to change.
So it's about exposure, right? It's about losing your social mask and being your real self.
Yeah, that perfectionism that we strive to constantly, like that pressure to be perfect, which women in particular, well, no, not women in particular, I think everyone does feel it in their own way.
Well, but then there's another one, I think, which gets me back to Anna and Leia, but, you know, like...
you just can't wait to bring it back up.
I just want Georgia to fall in love with me. Like, what I'm thinking about is you can get characters where the conflict is, I have this mission or this core value that you don't align with, right?
Yeah.
Where our core missions or values are actually in opposition. And so either I choose the value or the person. And it's a bit like Casablanca is not a romance, it's a love story because they choose the value over the person.
Yeah, like how to reach across that aisle.
Yeah, so it's like this moment where either one or both of you has to change your mission or core values in order to be together.
Yeah, I was just reading about that in Goal Motivation Conflict.
Oh, please do tell us about goal motivation and conflict.
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay.
People might not know about it.
Yeah, so
I think a lot of people won't know about it.
There's a framework by Deborah Dixon called Goal Motivation Conflict, and it talks about the sort of internal and external goals, motivations and conflicts of characters throughout, well, it's commercial fiction really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really talking about commercial fiction. She's very focused on romance.
And it's so interesting. If we're talking about Casablanca, and I haven't watched the movie in a couple of years, so do excuse me, his external goal is to like get her on the plane into safety, and her external goal is to just get her husband to safety or something like that.
He's resisting the Nazis. He's a really important figure in the anti-Nazi movement. So it's a bigger ideological picture. And Humphrey Bogart, on the other hand,
just wants his business to be like
he's more self-focused. Yeah. So she's choosing between an ideal of going and supporting, and bringing down the Nazis versus being with Humphrey Bogart because she loves him and wants him.
Yeah. And so their external goals at the end they both achieve them. Yeah. She gets on the plane with her husband and he goes to safety and he gets her on the plane.
And he also, I think, is thinking, if she stays here with me, she'll hate me and she'll hate herself.
Yeah. And so it just talks about how I suppose in enemies to lovers at the end, there's like that, conflicts or the goals kind of overlap.
Yeah, so someone has to grow. It might not be both of them. Yeah. So going back to my favourites, but like you've got Han Solo who's like a rogue independent, right? I'm just going to use this because I can do it really easily and I do it with students. But he is like selfish. He is a smuggler. He's chaotic. He's off on his own and he's terrified of being part of a system or belonging to a community, or he's a rogue individual. And then you've got Princess Leia, who's like the leader of the rebellion and is all about duty and responsibility and like fighting those Nazis, right? Yeah. And in order for them to be together, he has to give up his rogue individuality and join her cause. And that's the only way it can work. Yeah. And that's why the new movies suck, because they have him going back to being a rogue individual. So all the character development is undone, which is just boo.
Because they try to serve the plot more than they try to serve the character.
Oh, it's just fanboys. Fanboys cannot understand romance or the great love stories. No offense, fanboys.
Although I did like the Han Solo movie.
I don't want to talk about that.
Have you not watched it? No, did you say you haven't watched it?
I refuse to watch it and I don't want to watch it.
Really? Because I
Sean's
actually
favourite
think
movie, Sean Williams.
I thought it was quite bad.
I actually really liked it because I thought that it romanticized him better. Like I understood why he was a rogue in the first place and why it was so hard for him to work through his things with Leia. I thought they actually did a better job. Like, I agree, the new movies, they completely stuffed him up. But I actually think they did a good job on his backstory to put him in the position where he is by the time we hit the old movies.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, the Star Wars universe is confusing.
Yeah, getting back to romance is that thing you're saying there, that he has a wound that he needs to heal.
Yeah.
And she does too, but she doesn't. One of them has to give. Like, there has to be some compromise or it's not going to work.
And there wasn't any compromise in something like Casablanca, really. Well,
because it's not a romance.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
therefore it doesn't achieve the sort of romance thing.
Because romance is always about having to grow as a person.
And compromise with people.
Yeah. And Leia has to get softer and allow people to help her and love her.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think in a romance often it's the man who has to give and compromise, because otherwise we're not changing anything. Like, I think they are a fantasy, still talking het cis white here, like often, but like the man in these kind of biologically essentialist heterosexual romances has to recognize her and her values and wants and bend and compromise to get them to happen.
And that's the fantasy of a romance, because it is, in a het cis straight one, sort of about.
And we do have to give some
They
props,
do.
but there are men who do that in real life too. There are.
Yeah, there are none. No.
Sorry. I'm so busy thinking about that. I just realised what you guys were talking about.
I was going to talk about how also in Love on the Brain, I know that we're not going to talk about it much, but
Yeah, soon though.
sparked an idea how a lot of the time sometimes enemies are not necessarily enemies per se, but they're like misunderstood enemies. Like
They can't
Yeah.
really be an enemy,
they can't be
they? 'Cause
really
they have
big
to be
enemies.
redeemed.
Yeah. So like she, in Love on the Brain, she perceives him as like hating her.
So I think
And all
maybe
these sorts of
enemies is
things.
too strong a word, because last
Yeah.
episode, Kathleen, you mentioned rivals.
Rivals.
Yes,
but also
academic
maybe
rivals.
They're
Maybe
not really
also-
rivals in that one, are they?
Oppositional.
Oh, I think they
antagonistic.
are.
I think
Yeah, rivals.
they.
I don't think I think she sees him as a rival. I don't think he sees her as one.
But that doesn't mean you're not
Yeah.
somebody's rival.
I think it's interesting. Like, I think also maybe in A Court of Thorns and Roses, like, is Rhysand really Feyre's enemy? Or is he just...
I mean, in A Court of Thorns and Roses,
in
he
A Court
is.
of Thorns and Roses, he
In A
is.
Court of Mist and Fury,
Yeah,
not so much.
In Book Lovers, they're rivals.
in Book Lovers,
Yes.
they're rivals. Yeah, they're not... I wouldn't even... I
So what's the
wouldn't call them
difference between an
enemies.
enemy and a rival?
Well, an enemy implies hate.
Yeah.
But like the hating game, they're rivals.
They're rivals that they don't hate each other.
But in Love on the Brain, I think they are enemies, because she thinks he hates her, and
Yeah.
so she hates him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think enemy and rival is still the same. It's just like a degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film, the
Of
proposal, they're
competitiveness.
enemies. They're enemies to lovers, because Ryan Reynolds really doesn't like her.
Yeah.
Mm.
There's not really any rival there.
We like dropping all these texts without explaining context. Go and
Yeah,
watch
you
the
guys have
movies,
to know
people.
them
You have to
all.
read the books and watch the
If
movies.
you've come to a romance pod, I'm hoping you're a little bit around romance. And if you're not, then we're giving you a great list of where to go.
But even if you go to Anne of Green Gables, did you guys ever watch that? You're too young. Everyone my age and older, anyone who was around from the 80s, mid-80s on, will remember the Anne of Green Gables TV series that everyone was obsessed with.
Anne with an E came back. That was,
Yeah, it
that
did.
was-
It's slightly different though. There is this. If you guys haven't watched it, you should watch it, because the guy who played Gilbert Blythe, who's passed on now, Jonathan Crombie, everyone was in love with, but he did Longing really well, and he was a little bit like the Bridgerton guy, like could do Longing, but they were enemies to lovers, and they also, I think, in Enemies to Lovers, there's also a slippage somewhere in the text between enemies and friends. Do you know there's like often enemies to friends to lovers,
Yeah.
or friends to enemies to lovers, or enemies
Yeah.
to lovers to friends to lovers?
Yeah,
It's
there's
like it's like playing with that metaphor of the thin line between love and hate.
enemies to lovers to enemies again, and then back
yeah,
to
yeah,
lovers.
that's right. There's often a movement
Yeah.
between each stage.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like them navigating that, I suppose. But there's too many ways to define enemies to lovers. There's too many,
It's great. It's a
Makeup
lot of
it can
scope
be.
to it, though.
yeah.
I think what's interesting about some of these things is that fact that if you try to poke holes in them, they become slippery. But like overall, you say enemies to lovers and everyone knows what you're talking about.
Yeah,
like
they do.
there's this broadness to them, that generalization and universality. But then when you go, all right, well, what does that mean? And it's like what you said, Georgia, what you wanted to originally do was go deeper and look for that deeper definition. You go, wait, this is slippery. This is feminism. This is, these big topics where you suddenly go, hang on, it seems simple. It seems easy. But the minute you try to break it down, you go, oh, well, hang on, that's a different thing. Or wait, maybe I don't think this. Or when maybe it's different when you apply it into this. And
is some of it about viewpoint too, about these are books, enemies to lovers books are about people who are not seeing each other's point of view and about learning how to have theory of mind, right, and actually look through someone else's perspective.
Ooh, and maybe in the real het ones, it's like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like
hugely.
You're on a different planet.
Oh, well,
but even experiential planet, like they really do seem to be the kinds of texts that are about, and I think this sums up romance, that they are texts about seeing another human being, learning their context and experience, dropping your prejudices and assumptions and loving them for who they are.
Yeah, that's nice.
And won't we just look at all that in Love on the Brain in the next episode?
Hey, yeah, let's get into it in the book club.
We always get into it over books.
So I hope you've finished the book, everyone, because if not, you've got till next week.
Thank you guys so much for joining us today, discussing enemies to lovers tropes. It was super fun for us, I think.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
And hopefully you'll join us next week as we're discussing Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.